December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell like ash over the broken world. In the gray dawn, soldiers of the U.S. First Army watched the fog swallow their positions. They had been told the war was ending, that Germany's back was broken, that Christmas would find them in warm billets behind quiet lines. The intelligence reports assured them the enemy was finished. They were catastrophically wrong. Through the mist came the thunder of 2,000 German guns. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Wehrmacht's last great gamble, had begun. But within that conventional storm moved something unprecedented. Shadow soldiers in American uniforms, speaking perfect English, carrying forged papers, driving captured jeeps through American lines. Operation Greif, Otto Skorzeni's commandos, trained for months to walk, talk, and think like the enemy they impersonated. In the chaos of surprise attack, these phantoms would cut communications, redirect convoys, spread panic and assassinate officers. Traditional security measures proved useless. Passwords could be extracted, documents could be perfect, accents could be flawless. What the Germans could not forge was something invisible, something encoded in muscle memory and childhood ritual, the way an American shook hands. And in that cultural fingerprint, ordinary soldiers found their weapon against an invisible enemy. The strategic situation had seduced Allied command into comfortable assumptions. By December 1944, Germany appeared to be collapsing inward like a dying star. The beaches of Normandy lay 6 months behind. Paris had been liberated in August. Allied armies stood at Germany's western frontier. Soviet forces pressed from the east. The Third Reich's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Fuel reserves were critically low. Manpower was being scraped from boys and old men. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force assessed that Germany could only conduct limited defensive operations. The Ardennes sector, that densely forested hilly region spanning eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, was designated a quiet zone, thinly held by inexperienced or battle-worn divisions sent there to rest and train. Intelligence officers dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive through such difficult terrain, particularly in winter. They failed to appreciate desperation's mathematics. Adolf Hitler had personally conceived Operation Wacht am Rhein as a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, the same route Germany had used to spectacular effect in 1940, aimed at splitting the Allied armies, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace in the West. 25 divisions, over 200,000 men, supported by nearly 2,000 artillery pieces and 1,000 tanks, had been secretly concentrated in the forests east of the Our River. But Hitler's plan included something beyond conventional military operations. He understood that modern warfare's center of gravity had shifted. Communications, logistics, command, and control. Disrupt these nervous systems, and even a powerful army could be paralyzed. For this mission, he turned to SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the man who had rescued Benito Mussolini from imprisonment in a daring glider raid, whose reputation for audacious special operations made him Germany's most celebrated commando. Skorzeny was given an unprecedented task: create a brigade of English-speaking soldiers, disguise them in American uniforms with captured equipment, and send them through Allied lines to sow chaos during the offensive's critical opening hours. They would cut telephone lines, redirect traffic, remove minefield markers, change road signs, and spread false information. In the fog of surprise attack, these small disruptions would cascade into paralysis. The operation was named Greif, Griffin, a mythological creature that was neither fully one thing nor another, a chimera that defied categorization. It was an apt name for soldiers who would cease to be themselves. Skorzeny's recruiting campaign began in November. Messages went out to Wehrmacht and SS units. Volunteers needed, English language skills essential, special operations experience preferred. The response was disappointing. Despite Germany's vaunted education system, truly fluent English speakers were rare in the military. Those who did speak English often had heavy accents or limited vocabulary. Skorzeny had hoped for 1,500 men. He got approximately 200 who met minimum standards. These volunteers gathered at Grafenwohr training camp in Bavaria, where the deception began in earnest. American uniforms were collected from prisoner-of-war camps and battlefield salvage. Captured weapons were distributed: M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Colt .45 pistols, fragmentation grenades with their distinctive pineapple pattern, Captured or repainted vehicles were assembled. Jeeps, trucks, scout cars. Everything down to individual equipment had to be authentic. Canteens, mess kits, cigarettes, matches, chewing gum. Currency. But material authenticity was insufficient. The commandos had to learn to inhabit their disguises. American instructors, Wehrmacht soldiers who had lived in the United States before the war, or prisoners of war who agreed to cooperate, taught them American military slang, cultural references, mannerisms, customs. They learned that Americans were informal with officers, that they complained constantly about food and orders, that they chewed gum incessantly, that they walked with a different gait than German soldiers, looser, less rigid. They studied American popular culture, baseball statistics, movie stars, comic strips, radio programs. They practiced conversations about hometowns from Brooklyn to Texas. They learned regional accents, though most settled for a neutral general American pronunciation. They were taught that Americans often began sentences with "say das" or "look here," that they used first names far more freely than Germans, that their humor tended toward the irreverent. The training was intensive but impossibly brief. Culture is not learned in weeks. It is absorbed over lifetimes. Every gesture, every instinctive reaction, every moment of stress could reveal the fraud. The commandos knew they were being prepared for an extraordinarily dangerous mission. Captured soldiers fighting in enemy uniform would not be treated as prisoners of war. Under the laws of war, they could be executed as spies. As December approached, Skorzny's men moved forward into assembly areas near the German frontier. They carried forged identification papers, memorized cover stories, and wore the uniforms of the army they were about to fight. The psychological burden was immense. They would advance not as proud German soldiers but as impostors, depending entirely on deception for survival. The German artillery barrage began at 0530 hours on December 16th. For 90 minutes, the frozen forest erupted in fire and steel. American positions that had enjoyed weeks of relative quiet were systematically pulverized. Communications were severed. Command posts were destroyed. Infantry battalions, scattered across extended frontages, found themselves isolated and blind. Into this maelstrom, as dawn broke gray and bitter, came the panzer columns and infantry waves of 3 German armies. The shock was total. American units that had been told the enemy was defeated found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy, attacking with unexpected strength and determination. Within hours, the entire sector was in chaos. And through that chaos moved Skorzny's commandos, their small teams crossing the fluid front lines in captured vehicles, passing through American rear areas where military police and security checkpoints had not yet been established. Some teams succeeded brilliantly in their missions. They cut telephone cables, changed road signs to redirect convoys away from critical junctions, spread rumors of enemy breakthroughs in places where the line still held. But success planted the seeds of their eventual exposure. As reports filtered back to American headquarters of German soldiers in U.S. uniforms, as captured documents revealed Operation Grief's existence, as the first infiltrators were caught and interrogated, something unprecedented happened. Mass paranoia swept through American forces. By December 17th, the rumor mill was operating at industrial capacity. Skorzny, whose reputation had been inflated far beyond his actual capabilities, was credited with sending not hundreds, but thousands of commandos through Allied lines. Reports claimed that entire German companies were operating in American uniform. Wild stories spread. Enemy agents planned to assassinate General Eisenhower, to poison water supplies, to sabotage ammunition dumps. American military police established checkpoints throughout rear areas. Every soldier became a potential suspect. Guards demanded not just passwords but proof of identity, asking questions that only genuine Americans could answer. What is the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series in 1943? What is Sinatra's first name? Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? These improvised tests had mixed effectiveness. Cultural knowledge could be studied and memorized. Documents could be forged. Some commandos had lived in America and knew the answers better than soldiers from isolated rural areas who had never heard of Betty Grable or the Brooklyn Dodgers. What could not be taught, what existed below the level of conscious knowledge, were the physical habits that culture inscribed on the body itself. And American soldiers, desperate to distinguish friend from enemy, began to notice something that German training had overlooked entirely. The paranoia generated by Operation Greif achieved psychological effects far beyond what Skorzeny's small force could accomplish operationally. American headquarters became fortresses of suspicion. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was stopped and detained at a checkpoint when he answered a question incorrectly. A guard asked him the capital of Illinois, and Bradley said Chicago instead of Springfield. He was released only after furious protests and verification from his staff. General Bruce Clark was arrested and held for hours because he correctly identified the Chicago Cubs as a National League team, but a suspicious MP believed they belonged to the American League. Officers who had commanded troops through Normandy and across France found themselves answering questions about Betty Grable's hair color and the price of cigarettes in drugstores. The operational impact was severe. Convoy movement slowed dramatically as every checkpoint became a bottleneck of interrogation. Officers traveling to forward positions were delayed for hours. Communications became difficult as normal procedures were abandoned in favor of elaborate verification protocols. The paranoia, ironically, accomplished some of what Operation Greif had intended. American command and control were significantly disrupted, not by German commandos but by American security measures. Meanwhile, the actual infiltration teams faced mounting difficulties. Several commandos were captured in the first days of the offensive. Under interrogation, some talked. The details they provided, training sites, numbers of men, types of missions, allowed American intelligence to build a clearer picture of the operation. More importantly, captured commandos provided examples of how German intelligence had prepared them and, equally significant, what German intelligence had failed to anticipate. It became clear that the commandos knew American popular culture, could recite baseball statistics, understood military procedures, but they had been trained primarily through classroom instruction and role-playing exercises. They had memorized America. They had not lived it. The difference was subtle but under pressure often detectable. American soldiers at checkpoints began to understand that they needed to test not just knowledge but instinct. Questions needed to reveal not what someone had learned, but what they had absorbed unconsciously through years of living in American culture. The challenge was identifying what aspects of American behavior were so deeply ingrained, so automatic, that no amount of study could replicate them. Different units developed different tests. Some focused on slang usage, not whether someone knew slang terms, but whether they used them naturally and correctly in casual speech. Others tested sports knowledge with obscure details that would require not just study, but genuine fandom to answer. And some soldiers began to notice something even more fundamental: the way people moved their bodies in social interaction. The handshake test emerged not from official doctrine but from soldiers' observations. Multiple accounts from the Battle of the Bulge period describe American guards noticing that something felt wrong when shaking hands with certain individuals who otherwise appeared legitimate. The suspicion was instinctive at first, difficult to articulate, but as more commandos were identified and captured, a pattern became clear. Americans and Germans shook hands differently. The American handshake was firm, direct, and brief. The hand was extended with fingers together, thumb up, and the grip was solid. A whole hand clasp with several pumps of the arm. The motion was confident and casual, repeated countless times in daily social interactions from childhood onward. Greeting neighbors, meeting teachers, congratulations after Little League games, introductions at church socials, closing business deals. By adulthood, the American handshake was as automatic as walking. The German handshake tradition was more formal and varied. In some contexts, particularly military ones, Germans practiced a single firm downward shake, or a bow, with a brief hand contact. In others, especially among educated classes, the handshake could be lighter or involve different timing. More significantly, the social context for handshaking differed between cultures. Germans used the gesture more formally and less frequently in casual military interactions. The commandos had been trained extensively in American verbal behavior, but given little instruction in nonverbal communication. Physical culture is almost impossible to teach in a classroom. It must be absorbed through immersion over years. A person raised in one physical culture can mimic another, but under stress or when unprepared, instinct overwhelms training and the body reverts to its native programming. American guards began to use handshakes as a diagnostic tool. They would extend their hand casually, as if in friendly greeting, and observe the response. If the grip was wrong, too light, too brief, with incorrect timing, or with visible hesitation suggesting conscious thought rather than automatic response. Suspicion was warranted. Combined with other indicators, slight accent anomalies, odd word choices, incorrect equipment wear, the handshake test became a powerful tool. The Germans had not anticipated this vulnerability. Their intelligence services had focused on verbal communication and visual appearance. They had collected American uniforms, studied American slang, memorized American geography, but they had not recognized that culture lived in the body's automatic gestures, in the muscle memory of social ritual. It was a failure of imagination rooted in how intelligence itself was conceived, as information that could be gathered, studied, and replicated. But culture is not information. It is lived experience, encoded at a level below conscious awareness, impossible to fully transfer through instruction. For the commandos themselves, the mission extracted a severe psychological toll. They advanced through enemy territory stripped of their identity, unable to trust even their appearance in a mirror. Every interaction was a performance. Every conversation was an examination. The stress of constant deception, combined with the knowledge that capture meant almost certain execution, created unbearable pressure. Some commandos later described the experience as a form of psychological dissolution. To successfully impersonate an American soldier required temporarily suppressing their German identity, their language, their cultural reflexes, their personal history. Yet they could never fully inhabit the American role because doing so required decades of lived experience they did not possess. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully themselves nor fully their disguise. The moral dimension added further weight. Many commandos felt profound unease about fighting in enemy uniform. German military culture emphasized honor, valor, and direct confrontation. Deception operations, while tactically valuable, carried a stigma. Fighting while disguised as the enemy felt dishonorable to men raised in a warrior tradition that, however brutal and compromised by Nazi ideology, still valued certain martial virtues. Moreover, the commandos understood the consequences of their actions for legitimate prisoners of war. Operation Greif endangered every German soldier captured in American uniform, even those taken in conventional combat who had done nothing deceptive. It created an atmosphere of suspicion that could lead to summary executions of men who should have been protected under the Geneva Conventions. For American soldiers, the presence of infiltrators created a different moral crisis: the destruction of trust. Combat soldiers depended on immediate trust in those around them. In the confusion of battle, survival often required instant cooperation with strangers wearing the same uniform. Operation Greif poisoned that well. Every unfamiliar soldier became a potential enemy. The paranoia this generated had operational costs, but it also had human costs. The corrosion of the bonds that held military units together. The handshake test, ironically, became a small island of certainty in this sea of suspicion. It was a gesture that connected soldiers to civilian life, to normalcy, to the culture they were fighting to defend. In reaching out to shake hands, they were performing an act that linked them to home, to fathers teaching sons, to baseball teammates after a good game, to business conducted on Main Street, to the hundreds of small rituals that defined American social life. When that handshake felt wrong, it revealed not just an imposter but a profound difference in how cultures encoded social meaning in the body itself. As awareness of the handshake test spread through American units, it became part of an expanding repertoire of cultural authentication methods. But its effectiveness created an unexpected problem. It worked too well for what the commandos were actually doing. Most of Skorzeni's infiltration teams were not attempting to pass through multiple checkpoints or engage in extended interactions with American soldiers. Their missions were brief and focused: cut a telephone line, change a road sign, report on American positions. Many teams completed their objectives and withdrew without being challenged. The elaborate security measures, including the handshake test, were often deployed in rear areas where few commandos ever operated. The real impact of Operation Greif was not operational but psychological. The fear it generated achieved more disruption than the actual sabotage. This was apparent to German intelligence even during the operation. Captured American newspapers and monitored radio broadcasts revealed the extent of Allied paranoia. Rumors credited Skorzeny with resources and capabilities far beyond what he actually possessed. For the Allies, the threat had to be treated as real until proven otherwise. After the war, intelligence failures in the Ardennes were scrutinized ruthlessly. Senior commanders had ignored warning signs of the German buildup. dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted their comfortable assumptions. The surprise of December 16th was a catastrophic failure of analysis. In that context, overreaction to the infiltration threat was understandable. The handshake test and other cultural verification methods did identify several commandos. The exact number remains disputed. German records indicate that of approximately 150 commandos who crossed into American lines, around 40 were captured during the operation. Some of these were identified through handshake tests, others through speech patterns, equipment discrepancies, or simply bad luck at checkpoints where guards were particularly alert. The captured commandos faced military courts-martial for violating the laws of war by fighting in enemy uniform. The legal situation was complex. International law permitted ruses of war, including disguises, but prohibited actually engaging in combat while disguised as the enemy. Some captured commandos had merely conducted reconnaissance or sabotage. Others had engaged in combat. The distinction mattered legally but often not practically. In December and January, 18 captured commandos were executed by firing squad after military tribunals found them guilty of violating the laws of war. These executions were controversial even at the time. Some argued the men were soldiers following orders. Others that the law was clear about the prohibition on fighting in enemy uniform. The execution served as a powerful deterrent. Remaining German infiltrators largely abandoned their missions and attempted to return to German lines or surrender to American forces as regular prisoners of war. The handshake test represented something larger than a mere security procedure. It marked a moment when American military forces intuitively recognized a profound truth about culture and identity that formal intelligence services had not fully appreciated, that national identity exists not just in the mind, but in the body, encoded in gestures and reflexes that operate below conscious thought. Traditional counterintelligence focused on documents, languages, and explicit knowledge, things that could be verified through investigation. A spy could be caught by checking papers, testing language skills, asking questions with verifiable answers. Operation Greif revealed the limits of this approach. The German commandos had excellent documents and adequate language skills. Many could answer factual questions about American geography, culture, and military procedures. What they could not replicate was kinesthetic culture, the physical vocabulary of gestures, postures, and movements that people absorb through immersion in a social environment from birth. This dimension of culture had been largely invisible to intelligence professionals because it was so obvious, so automatic, that it seemed not to require analysis. The discovery had implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. It suggested that cultural authenticity could not be achieved through study alone, no matter how thorough. An agent might memorize an entire encyclopedia of facts about a target culture, speak the language perfectly, and still be betrayed by the way they held a cigarette, the speed at which they walked, the distance they stood from others in conversation, or the manner in which they shook hands. This insight would influence post-war intelligence training. The CIA and other agencies that emerged from World War II experiences understood that deep cover operatives required not just language training, but cultural immersion, years spent living in target societies, absorbing physical culture along with verbal and intellectual culture. The body had to be retrained as thoroughly as the mind. For anthropologists and sociologists, the handshake test became an example of what they called habitus, the deeply ingrained habits, skills, and dispositions that individuals acquire through their life experiences within particular social environments. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would later theorize extensively about how class, culture, and social position are inscribed on the body through physical mannerisms and reflexive behaviors that operate largely outside conscious awareness. The German commandos had attempted to perform American identity, but performance requires a script, and much of cultural behavior has no script. It simply is, enacted automatically by bodies that have been shaped by years of social participation. The handshake was a window into this deeper reality, a moment when the performance broke down because the performer's body remembered a different choreography. By late December, the German offensive was losing momentum. American forces, after the initial shock, had reorganized and were mounting effective resistance. Critical road junctions like Bastogne were held despite being surrounded. Reinforcements were arriving from other sectors. Clear weather allowed Allied air power to devastate German supply columns. The panzers were running out of fuel, ammunition, and time. Operation Greif had effectively ended. Most commandos had either completed their missions and withdrawn, been captured, or gone to ground hoping to survive until they could return to German lines. Skorzeny himself, who had commanded from behind German lines rather than infiltrating personally, recognized that his operation had achieved limited tactical success but significant psychological impact. The handshake test, by this point, had been formalized to some degree. Military police training incorporated cultural verification methods. Instruction emphasized that security relied not just on checking documents, but on observing behavior, how someone moved, spoke, reacted under pressure. The test was not foolproof. A German who had grown up in the United States might pass easily, while an American from an isolated rural area might arouse suspicion, but it added another layer to security procedures that made infiltration more difficult. More broadly, the Battle of the Bulge was teaching American forces hard lessons about complacency. The surprise attack had succeeded because intelligence analysis had been corrupted by wishful thinking. Analysts had dismissed evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative of German collapse. The infiltration threat, initially exaggerated, had nevertheless revealed how vulnerable rear areas were to disruption when security relied solely on conventional methods. As January 1945 began, American forces were pushing the German salient back. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and change the war's outcome had instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. The road to the Rhine was opening. Victory in Europe, which had seemed imminent in December before the attack, was now genuinely approaching, but the memory of those chaotic weeks would persist. Veterans of the Bulge remembered the paranoia, the uncertainty, the way every checkpoint became an inquisition. They remembered being questioned by their own MPs, having to prove their identity through cultural trivia. And some remembered the strange moment when a handshake became more than a greeting, when it became a test of authenticity, a way of reading identity through the language of the body. The handshake test would fade from formal military doctrine after the war, but it would remain in military folklore, a story passed among veterans about the time when soldiers discovered that culture lived in their hands. The final days of Operation Greif were marked by desperation and resignation. Commandos still operating behind American lines faced impossible choices. Continue their missions with diminishing chance of success, attempt to return through increasingly secure Allied positions, or surrender and face execution. Several chose to fight their way back. Small teams of commandos, abandoning their American disguises, attempted to infiltrate through Allied lines in German uniform or civilian clothes. Some succeeded, others were killed in the attempt. A few chose to surrender to American forces, calculating that military courts would distinguish between those who had engaged in combat while disguised and those who had merely conducted reconnaissance or sabotage. The calculations proved tragically optimistic. Military tribunals, operating under intense pressure and guided by strict interpretation of international law, sentenced most captured commandos to death. The defendants argued they were soldiers following orders. Prosecutors argued that fighting in enemy uniform was unambiguous violation of the laws of war, regardless of orders received. The executions were carried out at Henri-Chapelle, Belgium, and other locations throughout January and early February 1945. 18 men faced firing squads. Their deaths served multiple purposes: legal punishment under military law, deterrent against future infiltration operations, and perhaps revenge for the paranoia and disruption their operation had caused. Among those executed were men who had never fired a shot, whose missions had been limited to reconnaissance and minor sabotage. Others had engaged in combat while wearing American uniforms and were undeniably guilty under international law. The tribunals made limited distinctions, applying the law with harsh consistency. Skorzeny himself survived the war and was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes related to Operation Greif. His defense argued that the operation had been planned in compliance with international law. The commandos were instructed to remove American uniforms before engaging in combat. The tribunal acquitted Skorzeny, finding insufficient evidence that he had ordered violations of the laws of war. The distinction was technical and cold comfort to the 18 men who had already been executed. For American soldiers who had served at checkpoints during those chaotic weeks, who had questioned thousands of men and extended their hands in greeting that was also examination, the memory was complex. They had been tasked with identifying enemies who looked identical to friends. They had relied on intuition and cultural instinct to detect imposture. Some had been wrong. Others had been right. The handshake test had been one tool among many, effective but imperfect. What remained was the knowledge that culture ran deeper than language or appearance, that identity was written on the body in ways that conscious mind could barely comprehend. The true climax of the handshake test story occurred not in any single dramatic encounter, but in the collective recognition of what it revealed about the nature of cultural identity itself. In January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge concluded and American forces resumed their advance toward Germany, intelligence officers compiled reports on Operation Greif. They documented the number of commandos deployed, the missions attempted, the security measures employed, and the methods that had proven effective in identifying infiltrators. The handshake test appeared in these reports, noted as one of several cultural authentication techniques developed by soldiers in the field. What the reports could not fully capture was the philosophical significance of what had occurred. For a brief period, American soldiers had been forced to articulate and test assumptions about their own culture that were normally invisible to them. They had to identify what made them recognizably American, not just in terms of knowledge or language, but in terms of embodied practice, of physical culture, of the ways bodies moved and interacted in social space. The handshake test worked because it targeted something the German commandos could not have prepared for adequately, a gesture so deeply ingrained, so automatic, that it operated below the level of conscious performance. It was not that Germans could not learn to shake hands like Americans. Certainly a German who had lived in the United States for years would shake hands indistinguishably from native-born Americans. But the commandos who had trained for a few weeks in Bavaria, learning American slang and memorizing baseball statistics, had not absorbed the physical culture that would make their handshakes feel natural. This revealed a profound truth about deception and authenticity. Information can be transferred relatively quickly. Languages can be learned with dedication and practice. But the physical culture that makes a person's movements and gestures read as authentic within a particular society requires immersion over time. It cannot be taught in a classroom because it is not primarily intellectual knowledge. It is embodied knowledge, inscribed through years of social participation. The German intelligence services that planned Operation Greif were sophisticated, thorough, and creative. They understood language, they understood visual appearance, they understood cultural references, but they conceived of culture primarily as information, as things that could be learned through study. They failed to appreciate that culture is also practice, enacted through bodies that have been shaped by lifelong participation in particular social worlds. The American soldiers who developed the handshake test understood this intuitively, even if they could not have articulated it in theoretical terms. They knew, at some visceral level, that their identity was not just in their minds, but in their bodies. 70 years after the Battle of the Bulge, the handshake test exists primarily as military folklore. It appears in memoirs and histories of the battle, often as a colorful detail in the larger story of Operation Greif and the paranoia it generated. Some accounts emphasize its effectiveness, others note its limitations. The truth, as with most wartime innovations, lies somewhere between myth and documented fact. What is certain is that American soldiers did develop cultural authentication methods during the battle, that handshakes were among the gestures they observed, and that this observation reflected a deeper understanding of how culture manifests in physical behavior. Whether the handshake test identified numerous infiltrators or only a few, whether it was widely used or limited to certain units, it represents a significant moment in the history of military intelligence and cultural understanding. The broader lessons of Operation Greif extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The operation demonstrated that modern warfare had entered a new phase where psychological operations and deception could achieve effects disproportionate to their material costs. It showed that security in a complex mobile war required not just physical barriers and passwords, but cultural awareness and human judgment. For intelligence services, the operation confirmed that deep cover operations required not months but years of preparation, not just language training but cultural immersion. The CIA, established in 1947, would build its training programs with these lessons in mind, understanding that successful infiltration of foreign societies required operatives who could not just speak the language, but embody the culture. For anthropologists and sociologists, the handshake test became an example of how culture operates at multiple levels. not just in explicit beliefs and knowledge, but in habitual practices and embodied dispositions that individuals rarely consciously consider. It illustrated how much of social life operates through automatic behaviors that seem natural and unremarkable until someone from outside the culture attempts to replicate them. The 18 German commandos who were executed for their role in Operation Greif became controversial figures. Some remembered them as brave soldiers who followed orders. Others saw them as violators of the laws of war who received appropriate punishment. The moral complexity of their situation, soldiers ordered to undertake operations that placed them outside the protection of military law, raised questions about command responsibility and the limits of duty that remain relevant today. Otto Skorzeny lived until 1975, spending his post-war years in Spain and eventually becoming something of a legend, consulted by various groups interested in unconventional warfare. He maintained that Operation Greif had been lawful and that the executions of his men were unjust.